Got it. Great. Great. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Mike Feinstein. I'm from Santa Monica, California. I'm the elections database manager for our national party. And I am actually out of the country at the moment. And if for some reason the stream freezes or I drop, I'll come right back. So have no fear. So the Green Party of the United States, as you know, is a federation of state parties. And as political parties that run candidates, one of the most important services that we can provide
Mike, you're cutting out. You might want to start, if you can start one of the, as candidates, one of the most important services we can provide.
to our state party.
You know what else? It's happening again. And what I'm going to do is ask if people can turn off their videos, because that will allow the bandwidth to kind of, you can just up in the right-hand corner if you know how to do that. But if you can stop video, or we may do it for you. But that, excuse me, yeah, Mike is freezing. So please, yeah, if you can turn off the videos, that will be a big help. Mike, if you can start that again.
Okay. Okay. I've cut the video. Is it better now?
Yeah, we've had everybody else do it too, because I think it happens on this end. It's so yeah, keep the video off. Thanks, guys.
Okay, great. All right, so I will just start over because I don't know where it froze. So anyway, Mike Feinstein, Santa Monica, California. I'm the elections database manager for our national party. And as a national party, which is a federation of state parties, probably one of the most important services that we can actually provide in candidates we have around the country, how many Greens hold elected off their party. So we have had some form of an elections database since 2000. We've had 3 different versions, and the latest version that we have right now was created in 2017, the end of 2016. National Committee approved funding for it, and it was developed in 3 phases. It's still being implemented to some degree. I work under a contract with the GPUS, written by the steering committee and myself, that defines the work scope and my responsibilities. I am a volunteer, I'm not paid, but we wanted to have a contract to be clear about what I'm supposed to be doing and to create a set of expectations and accountability. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is a little bit different than the presentations I've made at previous annual national meetings. In our previous years, I've done a presentation on how the database works, where people have followed on the screen, and we've looked at the guts of it. And recordings of those presentations are available. But this one tonight is going to talk a bit more about what has been the progress that we've made on the goals and tasks that are defined in the job description, how your state parties and how you as individuals can be involved in that process. So this is kind of like a work progress update for us. And I don't know how many of you looked at the job description. I posted it at the National Committee list a few days ago, but I'm going to be going off of that a bit. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to ask Holly to keep track of those because I'm dealing with my phone. I'm actually in Vietnam at the moment, and my laptop actually went down last week and is sitting in a repair shop in Hanoi, and I'm doing this out of my phone while I'm in another city. So with that as an introduction, we've had about 6,500 plus Greens who have run for office since we started that we are aware of and who are entered in the database. And part of my task as a database manager is to get the records for all of those 6,500 plus green candidates, or greens who times where greens have run. Some of them have run multiple times, and to get all that information up to date and accurate by doing an audit of all of those races. That is a massive task. And the reason why, in part, we need to do that is, on one hand, to get the information as accurate as possible, but also, as I mentioned before, we've had 3 versions of the database in our history, and they've been designed differently. They've had different fields and categories, and different people have been entering the information over the years. And part of the goal of this database is for us to have the ability to compare apples to apples, to have similar categories and abilities to evaluate our performance electorally over all of these years. So that means going through all of those records and ensuring that we have the same types of categories in all of them. That's a lot of work, and I am partially the way through that. And what I'm trying to do with that is go through every state and do a certain amount of work on synchronizing all of the information, and then, as a check on that, to be sending a copy of that to each state party for their review. And that would go out in a spreadsheet to everybody. That's one of the tasks. And once we have the audit complete, or at least nearly complete, that then gives us the ability to do compare and contrast studies and reports that will be based on accurate information about how we've performed over the years, how many candidates in each year, how many candidates in different types of offices, what have been our performances for different types of offices, where have we had people elected for what types of offices, what winning percentages have we had, and therefore doing the audit first so that we have the foundation of consistent information for all of these 6,500 plus races is a must. I have done some studies already. We have some lists that are easy to do. For example, we have a list of all the Greens who have run and been elected or have changed parties into state legislatures. We have a list of all the Green city council majorities. We have the list of all the young Greens, all under 30 years old, who have been elected. We have a list of our best performances in 2-way congressional races, where a Green has run against one major party candidate when there hasn't been another major party candidate. But there's a lot more of those type of reports that we need to do. Now, one of the difficulties about doing that audit work is that in the immediate moment, I have the responsibility of entering data for who is running in the current year. And I want to talk a little bit about the challenges with that. And when I put out some of the problems we're having, I don't mean this as a personal criticism or a direct criticism of any of our state parties, but to identify something that we have to do better. And that is that I am spending an inordinate amount of time simply researching who is running in the states each year, because our state parties actually don't have that information available in a consistent, up-to-date, and accurate manner. And the more time that I have to spend on doing work of the state parties that they should be doing means that I don't have time to do a lot of the other work that I need to be doing to complete all the tasks for the database. So I sent a list to the NC a week ago or so. I did a brief spreadsheet looking at all of our state parties, how many state parties have a list on their websites of the following categories: how to run for office as a Green in that state, who are the current and past candidates, Greens in that state, who are the current and past Green office holders in that state. And the reality is there's less than a full handful of state parties that actually have this information about their own states. This is not a good look for us as a party on the individual state level. And myself and the CCC, the Coordinated Campaign Committee, are working on a proposal to send to the National Committee to set a set of non-binding expectations for state parties about the type of information that they need to be gathering and posting on their websites and reporting to us nationally. So the better that we can do there with that, then the better that I can do my job, and the better of a public face that we're going to have to the rest of the country. So that's number one. And to get to that point, I want all of you to be thinking about, in your states, is there a information oriented person who your state party, or persons who your state party can designate, who will take on that responsibility and really ensure and do it? So that's something that if that can happen, then I will be way more productive than I have been. Now, I'm on a contract with the party through early 2025, and what is kind of the objective to get to by that time? I'm not going to live forever. And right now, this database, how it works, how to put together the information, how to research the information, is pretty much dependent upon me. So what I'm trying to do is get us to a point that at the completion of my contract, our database is fully up to date with all the information about all the Greens who have ever run for office, all the Greens who have ever held elected office, and a series of studies and reports about all of that data, so that after that point in early 2025, should the party want to change and move beyond me, or should the party want to bring more people in to work with me, if something should happen to me, etc., then there will be a foundation of complete knowledge and reporting in place, so that then people can just be adding information to this foundation that's already there. And then that returns again to the idea that if I have to spend time doing the work of state parties, I can't get to the point of getting the database, the entire database, all the aspects that are in my job description up to date and ready, so that we aren't 100% dependent upon me, which again is stressing the importance of state parties doing their own data. Now, on the positive side, on the audit. Oh, and by the way, what I want to mention is that I am hoping to break down into individual spreadsheets and send to all of your state parties, for your own checking. I mentioned that before, but that's going to be one of the steps. And where I have gotten, like, one of the things that has to happen with the audit, what I'm trying to do first before I hand it over, is to standardize, get the correct names for types of offices. There's a lot of kind of mass work that has to happen. And one of the tools that I need, instead of auditing one record at a time, we've got a plugin now that would enable me to make the changes en masse. So for example, let's say that you have school board elections in your state, and in your state, they're called school committee or school board or governing school board or board of education, whatever it is. one of the things I'm trying to do first before I hand the information over to your states is get the correct name put in for the correct type of race in mass. And because different people have entered the data and it's been reported in different ways, often it's listed in very many different ways. And with this plugin that the party has got now and David Doonan has recently installed, I can now go and let's say that there's been 60 Greens who have run for school board in your state and there's 7 or 8 different names for it. I can then import in with this plugin without having to go record by record and change all of those to the correct type of name. And there's a slew of different types of data standardization that I'm trying to do that I want to do first before I hand this over to you. One of the things you should know is that the previous steering committee stood in the way of getting this plugin for us, and it has delayed that work a long time. It's a $199 one-time purchase plugin, and the finance committee, well, when I went to David Doonan, our webmaster, to ask him about it, he said, well, the finance committee has to sign off on it. So I went to them and they agreed. They thought it was a good idea. It was a one-time, pretty cheap deal, a one-time plugin like that. And then when it went to the steering committee, this was the time of the chaos when people were either had just resigned or were about to resign. And incredibly, of the 6 people who were left at the time, 2 voted yes, 2 voted no, and 2 didn't even vote. And the ones who didn't vote said, oh, we can't vote on this until we pass the budget, as if a $200 one-time expense was going to matter. And that meant that we didn't get it in time. David Doonan then had to go out on sick leave. As I think some of you know, he's had some physical ailments. Knock on wood, he's back in the swing now. But like that cost us a good deal of time. And anyway, so that's one of the ways that I'm going to be prepping the data to send to all of your states. Now, one of the interesting things that will happen when I send this data to your state is the database is designed in 2 different ways. There's one portion where it has the name of each person who runs for office. So like Dee Taylor from Utah, who's on this Zoom right now, she ran for, I think it's called a community council in Salt Lake City. It's a local advisory position. So in Dee's case, there's a area that we call candidates where you put in the name of the person, the city, the state, the county, and also the gender and the race and ethnicity. And then there's a separate part called the races, which are the individual times when you run. And then when you run, there's a pull down menu that connects back to the name of the candidate. And this portion with the candidates, this is something that eventually, and I'm going to describe how we're going to get there, but eventually we can answer the question, how many people of this or that have run as Greens? What has been the mix? What has been the racial and ethnic mix of our candidates? Now, over the years, again, we've had 3 different types of data recorded, or 3 different types of the database. And in many, many cases, the gender, the race, ethnicity wasn't entered, or in the case of race and ethnicity, we didn't even have that category in some of the earlier years. And for a lot of people, you can't tell by their first name. Even before we were having a category other than male or female, even, a name like Carol, for example, you wouldn't necessarily know male, female, or other. And therefore, to get that information, what I need to be able to do is to send a spreadsheet to the state parties. Okay, these are the 120 people who have run for office in your state, and they'll be able to see in that field, in that column in the spreadsheet, where we have a gender for a candidate and where we didn't have any. And then I'm going to be asking the state parties to go ahead and fill that in in the spreadsheet, and then I'm going to be able to import that back into the database. Once we do that, then we can generate reports. Now, the gender and the race and ethnicity are only available on the back end in the database. They don't show on the front end for each person. Obviously, to some degree, we're both respecting people's privacy, but also this is a statistic, at least at this point, when we had a specification to do the database and the National Committee voted on it, at that point, this was designated as a private piece of information for internal use. So for example, a few months ago, I didn't have complete information, as I mentioned, about race and ethnicity, but I went to our Black Caucus and I gave them a early preliminary report on this is what the breakdown is on race and ethnicity among our candidates. Ultimately, I hope that we will be able to do that sort of thing and have that kind of breakdown. And also to be looking at that progress over the years on how things are changing. And then we'll also be able to give to our caucuses the breakdown of who those candidates are and have been in the past, and they can go ahead and network and connect with those folks. So what part of the audit has probably been the most advanced? That has been with the Greens who have held elected office. And in that work, one of the things that is in the job description I had is to create a way of implementing a system to see how many Greens have held elected office at any time in our history, so we can get a sense about how we're doing with that. And to do that, I added a series of fields for the beginning date and the end date of each Green who has served in elected office and how they got into elected office. And I literally went through all the 1,400 plus times where a Green has been elected to office. And I've entered that starting date and end date. So you can imagine 1,400 different times doing that. And in many cases, I'm having to do a lot of investigative work to get that information. When somebody has been elected in a regular November general election and they have a 4-year term, then you know pretty much what the beginning and end date is. But a lot of Greens run earlier in the year in municipal races in the spring and summer, and those dates vary with the local jurisdiction or the county, city, town, county, school board, etc. Doing that work, finding those dates, is an enormous task because it's not so easy. And you have to go into records of small towns and villages, and their websites often don't list this information anymore. Maybe they listed it for 1 year, but it's not available in past years. I have spent dozens and dozens of hours in contact with county clerks and other local election officials and state parties, sometimes contacting these candidates themselves and trying to track those beginning and ending dates down. We're about down to maybe 50 cases out of the over 1,400 where we have the accurate beginning and ending date. And what we're using for this and why is this. Let's say that you had a November 5th general election. We use the November 5th date, which is the second Tuesday after the first Monday in November, as the starting date, and then the ending date would be the date before that election at the end of that term length, rather than the date that they're sworn in. Because what we really need to understand as Greens is, how have we done after each election? How many elected Greens do we have after each election? It doesn't really matter if they were sworn in, a week later or 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, and it's almost impossible to gather all that information anyway. So that's the way that we do that. And then in the database, we put in, did they get into office in most of these cases by getting elected and then finishing the end of their term. However, there are exceptions. there are a number of Greens who don't finish their term. Either they move out of their district, they resign for some other reason, they're removed from office by a recall or a court order, they've passed away, they've left the Green Party while they've been in office. So a lot of our statistics and our old office holder list, the reality is the state parties didn't track that information. If we were lucky, we learned that somebody got elected, but they didn't even follow their own office holders. And often those people left office. And I've had to do that work as well. And it's not been easy to track that information down, but pretty much have gotten most of that done now about the length of the time that these people have been in office. Now, one of the interesting things we get from this, of course, it informs us about how many Greens have been in elected office at any moment in time. But one of the things which is an interesting question is, how many times do Greens leave the Green Party once they're elected versus how many times do people who got elected when they weren't Greens join the Green Party? And that's a study, that's one of the types of studies that we're going to be able to do as all this information is fully accurate. And then I have the time to go through the spreadsheets and do that sort of thing. Now, in California, for example, we lost a lot of people to the Bernie Sanders movement. A lot of the people changed and left the Green Party to vote in the Democratic parties to go for Bernie Sanders. And there will be different cases like this in different states at different times. And eventually, we're going to be able to get that kind of political intelligence. So that then, of course, brings to the question of how often are we doing these lists of how many Greens have been holding elected office, and how are we doing with getting those totals. So I want to briefly talk about the methodology in doing that, and then kind of where we're at with how many years we've got that data for. So with the methodology, starting in 1998 on my old website, Feinstein.org, that's when I first, and I was the first person to do this, I first started doing a website where we listed how many Greens we had in elected office. A few years before that, I started doing list that I sent out on email to the old Greens USA Forum email list, but it was starting in 98 on my own website that I posted periodic lists of how many Greens were in office. And then in 2000, even before we had the GPUS, it didn't make sense for me to be having that on my own site. It made more sense to do that on a Green Party official site. Cameron Spitzer, who maintained the greens.org site, we ended up creating the first database on his site and moved that list there. So what has happened over the years is that we had a series of those lists, and I've gone to the Wayback Machine. Some of you are familiar with that. If you go to archive.org, and on archive.org, you can go back and go to like the old gp.org sites, or to the old one even before gp.org, or even back to the Feinstein.org. And you can find these old versions of our lists. Now, those versions were the best effort at the time, but we've continued in a variety of ways to learn about other Greens that have held elected office since those studies. So what I'm doing then is for those types of years where we have those old lists, I take a list for, let's say that it was in 2019. And what I'm doing is I'm doing a semi-annual list. I'm doing one list after the November general election, and I'm doing one as of July 1st. The July 1st one will catch all the changes that came in the spring elections. The November one comes based on what happens in the November general election. So I'll go back and I'll get one of those old lists, but then I export out from the database all that we have in the database that has these columns that have the fields for the beginning and ending dates for everybody during those times. And now I'm comparing and contrasting, going with those old lists and then using that kind of as a baseline. So say there's 100 people on an old list, but what we found is that maybe 5 or 8 of them left office before that day, but we didn't know about it. But then there's another 20 or 30 of them in the database that weren't there at that time. And I've gone through right now and I've done 2 periods, one from 2023 back to 2019. And that's been very labor intensive. And then I also started at the beginning of our history. I mentioned before that the first list that I did on my own site was in 1998. Before 1998, we had no comprehensive lists online of how many Greens we had in office. So in that case, since there were no lists to go off of, that was entirely based on what's in the database. And I started back in 1986 when we first started winning elected office. We won some county supervisor seats in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin, and I've done the semi-annual studies between 86 and 1997. And those are the first times that we've ever had comprehensive lists. And what I have done with those is, so I'll have the list of X number of people who were in office, and then I'll put the starting date and the ending date of their terms. So you can see, well, some of these people are in office for this 4 years and the next these 4 years. And by the way, when I'm mentioning about terms, for many times over the years, a candidate might get entered, but we never were told, was it a 4-year term, a 3-year term, a 2-year term? Were they filling a full term? Was it a partial, filling a midterm vacancy, etc.? It's been a massive amount of work trying to get that information up to date. And that involves in part talking to state parties or going to official election websites and clarifying how long is a school board term in Maine versus how long is a school board term in Pennsylvania versus another state. How many states are school board races partisan versus how many of them are nonpartisan? And what we found is a lot of times that the same type of race is listed as partisan and nonpartisan. So I'm doing the best I can. And this is why I'm often spending 20, 30, 40 hours a week on the database to try and track this information down. And I'm doing the best I can to get that as accurate as possible and then send it out to the states for them to go ahead and check it over and seeing if it's accurate. So going back then, I worked my way back to 2019, and I'm hopefully going to continue to go back from 2019 and fill in the time between 2018 and 1998. That's going to be very labor intensive, but eventually at some point we're going to be able to see how many Greens we've had in office. However, some of you have heard me rant and rave on our NC list about how important it is in the states that are registration by party states and who have nonpartisan municipal races to identify registered Greens who are running in nonpartisan races that the state parties didn't know about. I have been doing that work in California since we had Nation Builder, and actually a year before that when there was something called the VAN that ended up, the Democratic Party took that away from us. But when there have been an electronic version of the Green registration list, and then you can compare that list to the list of people who are running for public office in your state. And I've been doing that in California, and we've identified a lot of people who simply aren't connected on the day-to-day basis to the party, but they are self-chosen registered Greens. They've chosen to be in our party. They've run for office. They're getting elected. Of the current 147 Greens who are in elected office that we are aware of in the United States at this period, more than half of them have come from that kind of investigation. And that investigation has only happened in a small number of the registration by party states. What that means, it is likely that we are leaving on the table, we are underreporting the number of green candidates and office holders in the United States that we have. And since that number is one of the best arguments that we have to make a case for our party, as we get tired of hearing you're only running for president, or you're only running for governor. And the reality is we have a very good record of running for local office and winning local office. And our percentage on the year usually is between 30 and 45% of how many of those races that we win. So one of the tasks that state parties need to take on is to do this process themselves. And I want to give you an example in Maine. Maine, and I'm going to stop in a moment because we have only 20 minutes left and I want to see some questions because I could talk for hours. But in Maine, before they started this process in 2021, they knew of, I think, between 2 and 4 Greens who were holding local office. Since 2021, they've gotten as high as 63. Okay? So they've been undercounting between 50 and 60 local office holders. Now in Maine, they have a lot of local offices in small towns where you can get elected with a couple hundred votes. They have the highest per capita registered Greens in the country. So they're one of the most likely ones for us to find Greens. But there are other states that also have a good possibility. Massachusetts is one that I believe, because they have a lot of town hall meeting races. So what I'm going to be giving the steering committee is a proposal to generate funding by email blasting to all of our present and past Green office holders who are still in the Green Party, and asking them to fund a program where we can pay people to do this work, because there are very few people like me who have the privilege of the time and the expertise to do this kind of work. But we are probably significantly undercounting. And that also means that in past years, before we had these versions, we got as high as the high 230s in the early and mid 2000s. My guess is we were probably over 300 back in those days. In California alone, we probably were 30 to 40 to 50 undercounting, because back then we used to only know about our school board and city council Greens, but we didn't know people who were on some of the smaller water boards and park and recreation boards, et cetera, et cetera. So back when we were much stronger, then we were probably significantly undercounting. So we need to develop a program where all the states who are registration by party and have nonpartisan elections need to take this on. Then when we know about these people, we can involve them better in our press work, at our A&Ms, in our platform work, because they've actually governed and have experience implementing our policies, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all on my docket. And I guess what I'm getting at, there's a whole lot more that I could talk about. And if you have questions about that, it's in the job description. But I am praying that the work of the state parties that I have been doing, because it's essential for us to have this work done, get taken on by state parties, and that you folks identify people who will take this on. I will train them. Hopefully we can find some funding for them and we can get accurate information, and that will free me to do the kind of interesting reports and analysis that can have us become a more sophisticated political party, and to be able to provide information to, for example, the American Political Science Association, journalists who want to study us, people who we have to convince about why there should be the Green Party instead of all these other minor party efforts, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to pause there because we've got 15 minutes left. And since I haven't seen the chat, please, Holly, if you can help me, if you can stack
Sure.
people and otherwise.
Sure. So I'll try to get through some of this. Now, I think we've cleared this up. This doesn't have to do with nation builder or state parties keeping track of their own contacts and such, but I think you've explained this really well. You might talk a little bit about the database managers. One person is asking, oh, this would be a great job for students and or to train people. Some of us have found that students come and go which is fine, but there's also usually a database geek or an elections geek in every state that just follows this stuff anyway. So I wondered if you could talk about the status of the database managers. They're just volunteer, and when it's, one person doing one state or a couple people in one state, that makes it a lot easier to keep track of, as long as they're consistent. Could you mention that?
Yeah, so we actually have 2 database geeks in New York State. One of the most important, New York has the second most number of candidates in the database, over 600. And there